Hello there and welcome to this tutorial. Today we will learn how to use Unity's new input system to detect pinch interactions on touchscreens, as well as scroll interactions using the mouse. My name is Manu and welcome to another tutorial by Spatial Sparks. Oh, and by the way, I'll add a link in the description where you can download the code, so you don't have to type along if you don't really want to. To get started, I have added a simple scene to Unity with a sphere as well as a plane to do some testing. In your Assets folder, create a new folder called Input System. Now, first of all, we want to create a new action map where we will define our different interactions. For this, right-click in your Input Systems folder, click on Create, and then choose Input Actions from the drop-down menu. And name this Player Input Actions, or anything you choose. Now let's open up our interaction map and define our interactions. Double-click the interaction map asset you created to open the interaction map UI. And as you can see on the left-hand side, you can define different action maps. And in the middle you can define different actions and their bindings. If you're interested in more information about Unity's new input system, by the way, check out the awesome channels by Samyam and CodeMonkey, which I will link in the description. So let's create our bindings. First, create a new action map, and let's call this Player Inputs. As you can see, this automatically created a new action, which we can rename to something more useful. Then over in the action properties, we can set the action type to value and the content type to vector2. What I have found is that it's important to have a continuous value stream in the action properties, or the system that we're implementing won't work. As you can see, when we created our first pinch action, this also created an empty binding. So let's delete this binding. Now we're interested to create a system to detect pinches. This could be two fingers on a touch screen moving either towards each other or away from each other. So what we need first of all is to detect if two fingers are on the screen. To do this, we will add a binding with two modifiers. And we will define the first modifier to check if the first finger is on the screen, and the second modifier will check if the second finger is on the screen. The binding will be set to a continuous value, and here we can just choose something like the delta position of the touch. And that's it. We have added everything we need to detect pinch interactions. So let's move on to detect scroll wheel interactions. For this, let's create a new action and call it something useful like scroll mouse. In the action properties, we want to set the action type to value and the control type to vector2. Then we want to define the binding path as mouse and scroll to get the value of the scroll wheel. And there we have it. The input actions are all defined. Now let's add a basic player input controller to the scene. For this, add an empty game object and name it something useful like Player Input System. And add the built-in player input component to the game object. In the Actions field, choose the player input actions that we just created. And set the behavior to Unity events. As you can see, a new drop-down appears where you can define all different Unity events for the different action bindings that we have defined in the action map. And now it's time to create a C# script so we can hook up the events to functions that should be called when the interaction happens. Create a new C# script called Player Input Controller and open it in your favorite IDE. Now first of all, because we're using Unity's new input system, we will be using Unity Engine Input System Enhanced Touch, and we will define touch as Unity Engine Input System Enhanced Touch Touch, and we'll be defining touch phase as Unity Engine Input System Touch Phase. You will see why we do this later on. Now in our main class, first of all, let's define a public transform which we'll call a sphere transform, and this will be so we can test out our script. Then in the awake function, we need to check if the enhanced touch support is enabled, and if it's not enabled, then, well, let's enable it. Now moving on, we'll have two different methods which the Unity events will call. First of all, we'll have a pinch method, and the parameter will be an input action callback context. In this method, first we will check if we actually have two touches on the touchscreen, which we should because we defined this in the modifiers, but it's better to check again anyways. If we don't have two touch inputs, so if there are not two fingers on the touchscreen at the moment, then return out of this method. If there are two fingers on the screen, then we can get the touch from the first finger from the active touches array at position 0, and we can get the touch from the second finger from the active touches array at index 1. So we only want to calculate the difference in distance between the fingers if either the first finger or the second finger or both fingers have moved. And we can check if the fingers have moved using the touch phase. We also want to check that both fingers have a touch history. This means we're not interested in the very first frame that the fingers touch the touchscreen, because there will be no previous distance, and as such there will be no change in distance between the fingers. Now that we're sure that there are two fingers on the touchscreen and that either finger has moved, we can calculate the current distance between the two fingers, as well as the previous distance between the two fingers. And if we subtract the previous distance from the current distance, then we have the distance that the fingers have moved closer or further from each other. Finally, we can pass on this delta distance to another function that, for example, does some zooming. Moving on, the scroll method is much simpler, and here we only check if the input action phase has been performed. If not, then we return. And then we get the scroll distance from the callback context, and we read the value, which is a vector 2, and we get the Y value, which is the amount the scroll wheel has scrolled. We can then pass this scroll distance to another function which does, for example, zooming. And finally, just for testing purposes, let's implement a simple zoom function which actually just increases the scale of the transform we defined earlier. We also multiply the zoom distance by 0.01 so that we have some reasonable values for increasing and decreasing the scale of the transform. And that was actually all for the C# script. So now all that's left to do is to hook up the Unity events to the methods that we created. Don't forget to drag the player input controller script onto a game object. I'm just throwing it onto the same player input system game object that we created earlier. And then in the events dropdown for the pinch touch interaction, let's drag in our player input system, and under functions choose player input controller and pinch, and let's do the same for the scroll interaction. So this means that every time an interaction with the bindings that we defined in the action map is called, this will call the Unity event, which will then call our methods that we defined in the C# script. Now if we do a simple little test, we can see that it runs both in the Unity Inspector as well as on the smartphone. And that's already it. We have now successfully implemented a very simple pinch interaction detection system, as well as a scroll wheel interaction system, and hook this up in Unity with the new Unity input system. If you're interested in more content like this, then be sure to subscribe to this channel and check out my current project, which I've linked in the description. Also, feel free to drop a comment in the comment section with your ideas or potential improvements.